Okay, so a mere recitation of prayers will not do. We're looking at rather harsh penances and rather long penances. And Father John Laux, in his text Church History, speaks about the penance in the early church. On page 86 of Church History, Father John Laux, M.A. The church was to be a communion of saints, and those who sinned grievously were excluded from her communion, or excommunicated. In order to gain readmission, they had to submit to a long period of public penance imposed on them by the bishop. They dressed in a distinctive penitential garb. Once again, we hear that. They took their place among the catechumens in the vestibule of the church, and with them left the church before the offertory of the Mass. Absolution was given publicly by the bishop on Holy Thursday. Those who relapsed into the same sins were denied readmittance. 3 sins, idolatry, murder, and adultery, were visited with perpetual excommunication. And when Pope Callistus, in the 3rd century, declared that those guilty of adultery could be absolved after they had performed the prescribed penances, Tertullian and other rigorists opposed him bitterly for what they called his criminal laxity. In the 2nd and 3rd centuries, it frequently happened that Christians who were in prison awaiting martyrdom sent letters of peace to the bishop in favor of some brother under penance for apostasy, and the bishop, if satisfied with the sinner's contrition, restored him to the peace of the church. We also hear of councils mitigating penances that seemed too long and too severe. So a hallmark of the penance of the early church is that it is public. The bishop absolves you in front of the community. The penances were very long and very severe, sometimes years of fasting and works of penance. Now, Harmless does go on to explain this a little bit more. When he's talked about a story of a desert monk, and you can see the sort of division between how a rigorous monk and monastic community might approach confession and how a normal parish might approach confession. Because we generally know that monks are living a very, very penitential and ascetic lifestyle already. So perhaps they are already living a penitential life. To make a 3-year penance might be a little extreme for the desert monks. Now, it goes on here. It's a nice little story. The rigorous public penitential process just outlined, so we're talking about the stander, the faller, the hearer, and the mourner again, lies behind a story about Abba Pimen. One day, a brother admitted that he had committed a grave sin and said that he would impose upon himself a 3-year penance. In other words, he gave himself a sentence he would have faced in most churches. So this 3-year penance is probably something quite familiar to people in normal churches. But Pimen said, that's a long time. And the monk said, 1 year? And Pimen said again, that's a long time. 40 days? That's a long time. Pimen replied, adding, I think that if a man repents with his whole heart and resolves not to sin, that way again, God accepts a 3-day penance. Now, Harmless states, this is startling because monastic practice consciously and pointedly broke with church tradition or ecclesiastical tradition. These long periods of penance are rejected, and the desert abandons the order obtaining in the church. So we see in certain locales, certain styles of confession will be different. The monastic is already living a very harsh life, and perhaps to pile on a 3-year penance would be a bit excessive. Okay, so we see monastic penance is severe, regular church-like penance is severe, but we do have a change happening in the 5th century. So by the 5th century, Christian missionaries began to arrive in Ireland. The most famous of these, of course, was St. Patrick, who died in 493, who established monasteries and evangelized the people of Ireland. One of the great developments that came out of this evangelization was the creation of a new form of reconciliation. The missionaries to these lands saw a need for a form of penance that was private and repeatable. Instead of receiving absolution from sin after performing a long penance, the penitent's sins were forgiven immediately following confession, with the penance to be performed afterwards. So we are starting to get into our neck of the woods where we have the confession, the absolution, and then the penance, instead of we having the confession, the extremely long penance, and then only after the penance is worked, then you receive the absolution. So just as the confession was now private, the penance too would be performed privately. Typically, this would consist of prayer and fasting. Although still severe by modern standards, the nature of penance was determined by the seriousness of the sin and the rank of the person committing it. For example, if a priest and a peasant both committed the same sin, the priest would receive the harsher penance. Now, I know we've talked about this in class. Some states in life, there are higher expectations, and to fall from those expectations for some professions is worse than for others. As the centuries unfolded, Irish missionaries like St. Columbanus, who died in 615, began to leave Ireland to re-evangelize other parts of Europe. They brought with them this practice of frequent and private confession through the ministry of a priest. This form of celebrating the sacrament of reconciliation soon became the norm throughout the Western Church. The actual practice of going to confession in the Church today has changed little since the 5th century. All right, I think that's a good place to stop. We're close to 20 minutes, and I think we're doing fine. Please stay in the text, look at your notes, do the homework, and try to stay present, and we should be all right through all of this. Happy Holy Week, everyone, and we'll see you soon. Stay safe out there, people.